Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to our chapter's first community of practices. We're holding this first session during International Coaching Week, and we really encourage you. There's quite a few wonderful ICW activities happening throughout this week. And we really encourage you to go onto our Facebook and look over those if you haven't had a chance, and to participate as much as you can this week. I want to start by, first of all, introducing myself. My name is Jean Marie Bowman, and I will be your facilitator for the session today. I am a PCC credentialed coach, and I have my own practice called JMB Global Talent Solutions. I also have the pleasure of being one of the board members of the ICF UAE chapter this year. And I see from our participants who are just joining us now that we even have our president who is on the session, Dalal. Thank you for joining. And we have some of our communities of practice leaders. Hala has joined us as well. So thank you all for attending. And I wanted to speak just for a few minutes before we jump into our topic, and before I introduce our wonderful guest speaker. I wanted to speak a little bit about what communities of practice are in our chapter, and give you a little bit of background. Earlier this year, we asked our members to help us select topics for communities of practice that we thought would be interesting to our members this year. It's the very first time we've launched communities of practice, so I hope you have a little bit of patience with us. We're learning as we're going. But the members identified 3 topics that they would really like to hear about this year, and this is how we've formed our communities of practice. The first one is our topic tonight, cross-cultural coaching in the Arab world. And then there are 2 other communities of practice, team coaching. The very first session for them was held last night, and I see that some of you were able to join that. And then tomorrow night there will be another community of practice focused on manager effectiveness through coaching. So encourage your participation in those as well. Okay. With that, I would like to go ahead and advance our screen. Now here we get the first technical. Yeah, there we go, good. I just want to remind you what we're going to focus on in our session today, and thank each of you for participating. And remind you that you have all joined this webinar in listen-only mode, which means that you will be muted. This session is scheduled for up to 90 minutes. We may not go that long. The first 30 minutes we will be hearing from our guest speaker and asking some questions and having a discussion with her. And after this, we will open the session for your questions and input. So please have your questions ready at the end of our conversation with our guest speaker, so that you have an opportunity to join in the conversation. For tonight's session, we will explore 3 specific aspects of cross-cultural coaching in the Arab world. The first is to understand the unique diversity and cultures of the Arab world. What is that larger, bigger picture context? And then the second topic will be leadership in the Arab world. What are the opportunities, the challenges that our leaders that we coach face? And even we'll explore a little bit about how different leaders in the region might manage and lead differently. So we'll look at different leadership styles. And then finally, we'll bring it all back home to us as coaches, and we'll explore a little bit about what this all means for us as coaches, the implications, the lessons, and the actions we should take to be most effective in our coaching practice in this region. So with that, I would like to introduce and express my sincere gratitude for our guest speaker joining. I'd like to introduce Radhika Punshi. She is the co-founder and managing director of the Talent Enterprise, which is a regional human capital think and do tank. I like that, Radhika.
Thank you.
She is an organizational psychologist with a second Ivy League master's degree in positive psychology, which focused on happiness, well-being, and optimal thriving in the workplace. In the last 10 years, she has worked with over 200 organizations across the GCC, government, private sector, education, on their most pressing talent assessment and leadership challenges, and led some of the largest workplace research projects in the region. She has co-authored 2 books, Unlocking the Paradox of Plenty and Game Changers, and contributed chapters in 4 additional books, including one on WASTA and another one on employment and career motivation in the Gulf states. And finally, Radhika has designed the region's first and only psychometric assessments, which measures strengths and work orientations, and will be sharing some pretty interesting insights on leaders, youth, nationals, and expats from their ongoing research with the Thriving Index. So Radhika, welcome and thank you for joining.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Okay, and finally, before we get started, I see we have about 10 attendees at this stage. I'd like to ask for your input just to make sure our audio is working and to get to know, of course, a little bit about you. So, you know, we all are here in this region and interested in just getting a sense of where we all come from and where we've been. So what I'd like to ask you to do is in the chat box, if you can answer the question, where have you lived? And as an example, I give you my example. So my home country, I was born in the United States. I have lived in the UK and in Germany, Switzerland, and now in the UAE. And Radhika?
Yeah, I grew up in, I spent some of my childhood in India. I grew up in Oman. So Oman's second home for me. And then I was in the US briefly, and I've been in Dubai for 10 years now.
Okay, okay. So with that, I ask you to type in the same for you. Your name will show, so we'll get to see in the control panel here who you are. So just type in the countries where you've lived, starting with your home country and the others, just to get a sense of where everybody's been and what our backgrounds are. I'll let you take a few moments. Okay, we're getting USA, we're getting Canada. Let's see if I can. Some of the other places we have, UK and Dubai, Qatar, France, USA, UK, UAE, Spain, Lebanon and Bahrain, US, and now UAE. Wonderful, wonderful. So we have again, just in our session tonight, we have quite a few you know, different perspectives, and we're looking forward to getting your input. But I think this also represents for us and gives us a little bit to talk about tonight about the diversity of this region. So thank you for that. Okay, somehow. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and jump into that first topic, around unique cultures of the Arab world. Of course, each region and culture has its own way of doing business, and to effectively coach leaders in this region, we really benefit to understand what is unique about the Arab world. The geographic and political, cultural, economic, and social diversity of North Africa and Middle Eastern countries is obviously huge, as we see on this map. 22 countries with 300 million people. So the Arab world is definitely not homogeneous. There's no such thing as a typical Arab leader or a client that we might coach. You may have leaders from Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, of course the UAE. And Morocco is not Egypt, Egypt is not Lebanon, Lebanon is not the UAE. We have to recognize this, and with any kind of cross-cultural aspect of such a diverse region, not to, to resist generalizing and stereotyping. As diverse as this region is, there are some commonalities. For example, all of these countries have Arabic as a dominant language, and language is a very important part of any culture, as we know. So we will dedicate our next session to exploring how the Arabic language impacts our approach to coaching in this region. And another common theme that we see in the Arab world has been really the pace, the fast pace of growth, as oil and gas resources have fueled rapid expansion in literally every aspect of life in this region. Over the last six or so decades. And this progress has had very specific effect on people, of course, and on the labor market in the region. And that's where I'd like to start, Radhika. You and your team at Talent Enterprise have been a pioneer, literally, in conducting robust, objective research to identify unique characteristics that have emerged in what you call the talent landscape in the region. Why is the talent landscape important to our understanding of the Arab world culture?
Sure. I think it is. Thanks for that, and yeah, looking forward to the time together that we have. I think the talent landscape in the region is very, very important to understand, especially in our work as people managers, as coaches, as HR professionals, psychologists. I know there are quite a few of you have a background in psychology and human behavior as well. It's important to understand where people are coming from, sort of what their mindsets, what their beliefs, what their fundamental behaviors might be, but also the context in which they interact with others. And also, I think the Middle East, I've been here 10 years, is extremely dynamic, and we're seeing changes every day. So it's not only important to understand where we come from, but where we're heading to as well. And what makes the Middle East unique compared to, or the Arab world unique compared to a lot of other places that we might have all lived and worked, which are also diverse, is, I think, the first is the geopolitical landscape. Across the region is very diverse, and that impacts, I think, the social contract, the psychological contract of how people work and interact together. And the talent landscape is also evolving with more and more young people joining the workplace, with more females coming into work. Obviously, really interesting dynamics between nationals and Arabs and expatriates. So it's also moving at a very fast pace, and I think what's happened in the past is there have also been a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions that sometimes get perpetuated in a very fast-paced, diverse, segmented labor market that we have. And our investment in the research has really been to bust some of these stereotypes and myths and really move from opinion-based practice to more evidence-based practice, because once we know where we stand and where we're at and where we're heading, you can actually do a lot more in terms of investing in progress or investing in change.
And I think I appreciate that, Radhika, because I think that one of the things when we started looking at developing this community of practice, clearly there's an appetite in our members, but we could find very little research, truly, evidence-based research, as you said. So, so your work is really important, and it's actually there's not many out there that are doing that in this region. Thank
you. Yeah.
if we could, especially you've written about the research that you've done over the last 10 years or so in the Arab world, and I'd like for our discussion today if we could focus on a couple of specific areas around the talent landscape that really shape the uniqueness about what is unique about the labor market in this region that we don't see in other parts of the world. And there are three of these unique qualities, I think, that you spelled out in your research that I'd love to hear more about. The first is, that over the last generation or so, this increase in birth rate, dramatic increase.
Yeah.
I think it's twice as many, as many babies have been born here as the global average, right? And what impact has that had on youth unemployment? I understand we have a significant issue of youth unemployment in the region. And could you also talk about the paradox of plenty? I like that term that you use in your first book here to describe this.
Sure. And I think with, we were saying that it is a dynamic market, there are lots of challenges of working and living in the Middle East, but I think there are also a tremendous amount of opportunities, and I guess that's why we're all here, for that art of possibility. And I think what makes that come alive more than anything else is this youth bulge. So we obviously have this 10-15 year window of opportunity where we have a lot more young people joining the workplace across the Arab world, and the replacement rate's almost 1:6. So for every one person who is leaving the formal workplace, we have 6 to 8 young people waiting to take their jobs. So that creates a very interesting dynamic in the way jobs are created, in the way employment opportunities are generated, but also what happens within organizations around kind of dynamics between the older generation and the younger generation who's looking to take those roles, our expectations of young people as well. And we really do call it a paradox of plenty, especially in the GCC, perhaps not so much in the Arab world, because of the fact that we obviously have a demographic opportunity, which is plenty of young people, qualified, educated, usually quite motivated, joining the workplace. We also have the financial resources to do something about this. And the other two places right now where we're seeing a youth bulge is in Africa and in Latin America, and a lot of those places do not have the financial resources that we do to have an invest in youth. But it could also very quickly become a missed opportunity if youth are not coached, guided, mentored to kind of be much more active, active participants and contributors to the labor market. Because we also know sort of the geopolitical environment that exists. It's really important to direct their potential and coach and guide them to make those choices.
So not only is this is going to, in the future, we're going to see this as a dynamic of a culture, but it's an opportunity for us as talent management professionals and coaches to help prepare this next generation.
Absolutely, and I think the only way we can prepare them is to understand them, and the only way we can understand them is by kind of figuring out what the research is saying, because I also find a lot of research that does exist in the region does play up to the stereotypes, or it actually generalizes, saying this is how youth are in the Arab world, and someone growing up in Egypt is very different from an Emirati growing up in Dubai, or an Emirati in Al Ain versus Dubai. So we really do need to kind of break through some of these stereotypes. There are similarities, of course, but there are also very significant differences, which, especially as coaches, mentors, people managers, I think we need to understand a lot more, and I don't think we do enough.
It's a big opportunity. So another area of distinction and that's unique about this culture in the Arab world that you spell out is that we're seeing, again, over the last decade or so, maybe an increased inclusion of females in the workplace. What can you help us understand about that dynamic?
And I think that really is something to watch and something we feel very personally about, and I feel very personally about. I mean, obviously, if we see in the last 5 or 6 years, the GCC specifically, again, has one of the highest rates of females entering the workplace. Especially in a place like Saudi Arabia, it's moved from 5% to 18% in less than 5 years. And what's interesting about that is it obviously changes not just what happens within organizations, it also impacts, again, the social contract. When you have your mothers, your sisters, your daughters, your wives come in, a lot of it is driven by economic reasons, but it also is driven in by young females being enthusiastic and wanting to contribute to the workplace as well. But it also brings in a lot of challenges around how we support them through the employment journey, and also how organizations need to adapt their HR practices or their people practices to be more inclusive of females coming in. One thing that's really interesting about females who do work, for most of them it still is a choice to actually come into work, especially in places like Qatar or the UAE or Saudi Arabia. So when they are at work, they're actually quite self-selected. So they're very motivated, very driven, very career-focused, and basically have to prove something either to themselves or their families or to people around them. So there's it's a choice in most cases. I mean, obviously some do work for sort of economic reasons, but it's a very different set of females we're starting to see, especially the younger females. But we're obviously continuing to lose a lot of females as we kind of move up the organizational pyramid. So we kind of drop almost 50% of females at every stage. So just to explain that a little bit more, 60% across the GCC of graduates are female. So we have 60% more than men, more than young boys. Only about 30% join the workforce. And then by the time they get to middle and senior levels, it's 15%, down to 6 or 7%. And obviously very few females at board or, C-suite positions. So again, as coaches, our responsibility, especially to help females kind of navigate the transition, the career transition phases, is really important if we want to have a more sustained female workforce.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. That's quite dramatic. Those are quite dramatic statistics that you've outlined. And the third area that is unique about the Arab world is this ongoing dependence, should I say, of foreign expat workers. I think the statistics in the UAE is that up to 80% of the workforce is still foreign workers at some capacity. I know that across the other countries in the Arab world, it does differ significantly. But what can what does your research, what have your findings told you about that as a characteristic of this Arab world?
Sure. I think expatriation is a really interesting topic, and I think we could spend like a whole webinar just talking about that. But I think briefly, obviously, if you look at sort of when our labor markets were evolving in the 60s and 70s, because we did not have enough of a local population, there was this historic dependence on getting people from outside. And typically, if you look at the historical where external workers came from, it was mainly the Indian subcontinent, UK and US to some extent. That's changing very, very fast. And what's really happening, because there is now this youth population, so there are a lot more young people who are actually ready to take on a lot of these jobs. They might not be skilled in the right sense, but they're actually, at least from a basic sort of workforce perspective, there's more local availability of talent. So what really is happening now, especially with government policy, is, and it's different in every country, I must say, because I think the UAE and Qatar are quite distinct. I think they'll continue to rely a lot more on foreign workers. It's important for sort of their sustained economic growth. But if you look at places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt obviously has never had that historic dependence, but even within the GCC, if you look at Oman, Bahrain, expatriates are now, I think, coming in more at very highly skilled roles, are actually extremely unskilled, sort of our laborers and sort of our blue-collar workers. And also the nature of where expatriates are coming from is changing. So in the last couple of years, it's mainly been an influx from China, interestingly, especially in the UAE and in Qatar. And also if you kind of go to a restaurant in the UAE, you'll see a lot more people from Africa who are actually there instead of people from India or Philippines that you might have seen in the past. If you take a taxi in Qatar, it's mainly people from Africa again who are cab drivers, not sort of what you'd expect. So it's not just the way, the skills of who we attract, but it's also the kinds of where they come from, basically, that is starting to change.
Which, of course, will shape the future as we go forward, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, somehow my screen continues to freeze. I don't know why that is, but it's preventing us from advancing the slides. We're back, I think. So now, if we could shift to our discussion on the second topic. So we've talked about the culture. Now let's shift to speaking about leadership in the Arab world. As coaches, leaders are typically our clients, and so it's really important that we understand, how do we help them be successful, in this Arab world. I guess the key question that I'd like us to explore here is if leaders, if in your findings, if your experience, Radhika, if leaders in the Arab world lead differently to be successful, differently than in other parts of the world, do you find that in your research that successful leaders in this region, maybe high potential leaders or high performing leaders, really have a unique style that they use to be successful, for example, how they are managing their people?
Sure. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I think more than understanding, and it's really important to understand how leaders lead or how they should lead. Not all of them actually end up doing leading in a certain way, but I think it's also important to understand what challenges or opportunities leaders are facing right now, right? And I think a lot of that drives actually how they behave and what their leadership performance of leadership might be defined as. And I think even in the last 12 months, and you might find this in your own work, I think leaders are up for much more increased pressure to perform and to deliver and show impact. So there's obviously a lot of economic pressure recently. So whether you're in a government organization or whether you're in a private sector organization, irrespective of industry, there's a lot more, the good times seem to be kind of moving away. So there's a lot more economic pressure on making tough business decisions or kind of taking a lot more ownership around the decisions you make. There's a lot more pressure from the board or from the government. So there is that kind of leading in a challenging, tough environment. There's also increasing and constant influx of interventions from governments. And if you look at the Saudi Gazette newspaper, I thought it was really interesting. This is from a few weeks ago, and this is just headlines for a day. It talks about a sudden shift in policies.
I think we might be having some technical difficulty with the slides. I want to fix this because we want to look at this slide here. Let's see.
Yeah, just give us a couple of minutes. Let's see if we can.
I want to make sure that you can see your slides. Can somebody on the phone? Let's see. We are having a little technical difficulty. This is why I ask your kind patience. Let's see. Hala, can you tell me if you're seeing the screen? Can you see the slides? I've unmuted you, Hala.
Yes, Jean, I can see them.
Can you see the slide that we're on with the newspaper?
Actually, I can see all the slides together, not one specifically. So it's like.
Yeah, you can see the thumb, but not the others. Okay. Again, technical.
You have to go onto the bottom left where the slide sorter view is, and you go on the right one. Go down with your mouse, left on the bottom, down, down, down to the left bottom. And there you go onto the single slide instead of the slide sorter where you have them all sorted.
Just go to this one. Yeah. It's on slideshow.
Let's see. What if we just did this?
Yes, and you go on to the other one. Go to the third one from the left. This one.
Are you able to see the one slide?
Yeah, but it's with notes at the moment because you're still on the very left one. Go into the one that you were. Just click that one again.
It's interesting because actually on our screen we can see it in full slideshow mode, but for some reason it's not projecting that to all of you.
Yeah.
Because we are on slideshow mode. Let's try it once more.
Maybe if we just do this and get rid of...
Yeah, just minimize the notes and just increase this to, yeah, just click here at the bottom, yeah.
Oops, that's a little too large.
Is that better?
We have now the starting slide where it says ICF Communities of Practice.
Ah, interesting. Okay. Let's see if I can go back. Apologies, guys, for the technical. This is our first attempt at the GoToWebinar.
Jean-Marie, why don't you just go to share and just go to full screen, because maybe that's what's happening. So just go to my screen, maybe. Okay.
Main screen.
Main screen.
Okay. Does it change? See if we can unmute some other people here. See, it doesn't let us.
I think we can, I mean, we'll obviously share the slides with you guys. Apologies for this, but maybe we can just talk a little bit about, I mean, there's not too many slides anyway, so maybe we can just talk about some of the key points and then share these with you. Apologies.
Absolutely. So sorry, guys. I don't know exactly what has changed, but we'll keep going because we don't want to let the slides take over for our conversation. So we were back at talking about some of the leadership aspects.
Yeah, and we were talking briefly about the changes, right? So I was just saying there's a lot that's changing from a governmental perspective. So if you look at, and you probably can't see this, but there was the Saudi Gazette, you know, headlines from 3 days ago. There were 3 big major labor market, you know, changes, policy changes, which in other countries would probably take a year or two to announce. And it was talking about not having any foreign dentists in the ministry. They were talking about getting rid of expatriates completely in the public sector, and also about women, and the Shura Council talking about having them drive all within a day. So not only are leaders faced with sort of the economic and tough business decisions as an extremely fast-paced, you know, regulatory landscape that they have to deal with from a talent perspective. And then the third is technology. So obviously in the past, a lot of leaders could kind of manage how they communicate very directionally one way. You know, I decide who I speak to at when, and obviously with the Twitter generation and kind of with social media, you know, people are actually demanding answers of these leaders and talking about it in a much more public forum than they've done before. So what does that mean in terms of leadership behaviors? It obviously means, I think leaders, and our research says this, leaders definitely need to have much more resilience and a lot more grit around how they manage and lead. They need to have a much more open communication style and a mindset around being transparent and being open, which they probably haven't been as much in the past. And there's a lot more to it, but I think those have been probably some of the headlines.
Yeah, that's That's really interesting. And the other thing I'm wondering if you can speak to is the different kind of leaders that we have in this region, just because of the nature of our diversity. So obviously what comes to mind is Arab nationals, and also expat leaders, quite different, you know, they've grown up differently, probably, they've learned in different contexts. Some, you know, have kind of climbed the ladder, more expat leaders, and where maybe Arab nationals have learned through the family, or, you know, in an accelerated pace. Female leaders, as we spoke to, you know, are maybe a subset of the differences, as well as young leaders with, again, this you know, this birth bulge. So, you know, have you found that these leaders approach their leadership roles in different ways? And if so, what does the, you know, what do your findings indicate?
Sure, and I think, again, I'm going to be cautious about not generalizing about what we talk about. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about the research and then talk about what we've seen in our personal experience. So from our research, obviously we've seen that the prevalent style, or the preferred or expected style from leaders, is sort of this benevolent patriarchal style, where someone who is typically a leader has to kind of look after the family, which would be the organization, kind of make sure there's equal distribution of benefits and responsibility. So there is that expectation, I think. Obviously, if you look at Western expatriate leaders, they might be a little bit more uncomfortable with that style, considering where they're coming from. Maybe leaders who do come from non-Western countries might be at least familiar with that style of leadership. I think what's interesting here is, compared to everywhere else in the world, leaders have the single largest impact on aspects such as employee engagement and performance. So even the most junior employees in the organization expect the leader to know them, know their name, know their background, know their history. So there's a lot more demands, again, on what leaders need to do. Our research, we do find that expatriate leaders, especially the ones who've been here for a while, have typically been brought in for their technical expertise, and they've grown through the career and grown through the career ladder based on knowing what they do, which is the technical expertise. So they may not be the best people managers, coaches, and mentors. So I think sometimes with expatriates who've been here for a while, we do find that challenge with great technical leadership, sort of great direction, but probably not the best people managers, which I think is a great opportunity from a coaching perspective. We also find especially with national leaders, which we'll start to see a lot in the UAE, and we already do, most of them have had a fairly accelerated career growth. So you'll be probably coaching CEOs who are 32, 33, who might be extremely sharp, extremely capable, but just don't have the years of experience, and maybe the sort of exposure to, you know, managing a business through all sorts of cycles, etc. And what we find with especially that group of leaders who have accelerated very quickly in this region is that sense of fear of failure. We've got here really quickly, but if we fail, or if we don't end up doing a good job, what will our family say? What will society say? So when we work very closely with senior leaders, we've definitely seen that issue as well.
Okay. Okay. Good. All right. I'm going to try to advance to the next slide. I don't know that it's doing anything. That might be one thing, Radhika, we could change. I could give you the presentation.
Sure.
A control, and see if you can move over to the other slide.
Okay, let me try that.
Let's see.
It's actually logging me out, so I'm going to go back in. Just give me a second.
Okay. And while we're trying to get back on track technically, you know, I'd like, again, continuing with the topic around leadership in the Arab world. You know, I'd like to oh, great. Let's see. So let's see. You should get control of it. We're switching and seeing if Radhika can take over, and maybe that helps. Okay, that looks promising. Let us know in the chat if this is working now. Our slides are working. Radhika, you have developed, in my understanding, the only, as we said in the introduction, the only psychometric assessment that is really unique to this region. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this in respect to studying leaders in the Arab world, and what has this, using this instrument, what has this instrument helped you discover about, about, it's called the ETI, maybe you
the Thriving Index. Yeah, so just briefly, and I'm happy to share more information with anyone who's interested. So 5 years ago, we developed a psychometric assessment called the Thriving Index, which really looks at strengths based on sort of some of the philosophy around positive psychology, strengths, but also mindset and work motivations of talent, both expatriate and national talent in the region. And since we've developed it, and also in the last 5 or 6 years, we've actually seen some really interesting trends. And maybe what I'll focus on now is what we see differently about high-performing leaders and high-potential leaders compared to others, because I think from a coaching perspective, that's probably going to be of most interest to you. So what is it that differentiates high-performing leaders? So if you can see your screens now, what I will be talking about is essentially some of the factors. So the way we define our scale is we have 10 factors, which you can see on the left, that we measure around individuals, and then we have about 27 different sub-factors that we talk about. And some of the concepts which you might be familiar with is around growth mindset. So what we see with leaders who are actually high potential or high performing definitely have this inherent belief and a significantly higher growth mindset, almost 25% more than leaders who are not at that level of performance. So that definitely is a very key differentiator. We also see high-performing leaders in the region have that sense of resilience, of being able to deal with setbacks, being able to deal with when things don't go well, being able to face up to challenges. And if they do have a high growth mindset, then they also can take people along with them through tough circumstances. So these two skills or these two strengths work very closely together. We also find, especially for expatriate leaders, grit is very important, because there is a high rate of expatriate failure, sometimes of the failure to integrate culturally within the Arab world, because it is a very distinct working culture. So
and Radhika, can you define what grit means for us?
Sure. So I think very simply for us, and grit really is about that sort of longer term perseverance of being able to, have a 3, 5, 10-year goal that you can kind of set your mind to and actually work towards. So it's very closely linked to being able to set goals, but then also achieve them along the way. While resilience really is about dealing with setbacks that might happen. So grit really is a longer term focus on the pursuit of outcomes. And we find that's really important for expatriate leaders, because the ones that don't have these might sometimes get a bit deterred by some of the challenges they might find in the region. And I think lastly what we see, and there's a lot more, but the third aspect that is very, very important for high performing leaders in the region, and we've actually done this study with about 2,000 leaders, 800 are high performing or high potential, and then about the 1,200 were sort of our control group. The other one that's really important is efficacy, or the sense of agency, of actually being able to put in that effort and saying, I have that sense of agency to actually put in an effort or make a decision or stand by a decision and see that change, because you can actually have a lot of passive observers in the way. So that sense of efficacy is actually 40% higher almost than leaders who don't have or don't demonstrate high potential.
And in the Thrive Index, have you been able to see any unique qualities that stand out for Arab national leaders, different than expat leaders?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So what we see with Arab and actually GCC actually would be the right way to say it. We don't have as much data from broader Arab world, but what we see of GCC leaders is ambition is actually quite high. So they are very career focused, very focused on that sense of achievement and ambition. We also see them much higher on that sense of optimism around, it's probably, because of the way the labor markets are and that sort of growth potential they see. And we also see this, it's a really interesting interplay between internal and external motivation. So a lot of Arab leaders and national leaders are very motivated by having that sense of contribution or to their company or their country, because they really feel that they are making that impact and contributing. So a very high sense of internal motivation and purpose, but also quite high on the extrinsic motivation. So they need that sense of external validation, progress, whether it's career, financial, artifacts of status, as we call them. So very interesting interplay between being very high on intrinsic motivation, but actually equally high on extrinsic motivation, which is not a pattern we've seen to many other places.
Okay, okay, interesting. We were going to ask a poll. We'll go ahead and try this just as a way to close out on this particular topic, and ask for engagement from all of you on the call. Just to wrap up the focus of what we've heard from Radhika on leadership. From your perspective, which of these attributes differentiate high-performing leaders in the region? And which ones would you select? You can select one or more of the following. Curious growth mindset, drive, accountability, comfort with ambiguity and diversity, resilience, or all of the above. And we've got some people voting, so it must be working. Yeah, we're about 50% of you have already voted. Thank you very much for participating. We'll leave it open just a couple of, maybe 30 seconds more, just to get your input from those of you who haven't had a chance. And we're starting definitely to see the trend here. Yeah. So I think this is probably going to, see if it shows up on your screen, or if you can share the results. We have very smart people who are absolutely listening, so that's encouraging that you're out there. And 67% of you have indicated that you think this is all of the above. What do you think? How would you? What do you think the answer is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is all of the above. It might be different things in different organizations or different contexts, but I think all of these aspects, and our research clearly says that all of the above are very important. We've not really talked about learning agility or cultural diversity as much. That's very, very important. And also that sense of accountability, which to some extent stems from that sense of efficacy, that I feel I can put in the effort and I feel I can impact an outcome. Hence, I'm accountable for the choices and decisions I make. So yeah, I would definitely go with the group on this.
Okay, good. Well, if we go to the next slide, this is our final topic and for the evening. And it really is the so what question I think that maybe all of us are asking ourselves is, you know, how do we as coaches be most effective in the Arab world? And as coaches, you know, what are you hoping to take away from the session? And what are you, you know, as you're hearing the input and the findings from Radhika, you know, what are you reflecting on as how you can strengthen your effectiveness as a coach? Maybe think about what has worked well for you as you've been coaching leaders in the region, and also as what has perhaps not worked well, and what learnings did you take away from the experience, and most importantly, what have you learned from this session that maybe you can build into your coaching practice going forward. And I thought maybe it might be helpful to share some of my lessons in the 5 years that I've been here coaching leaders, and then hear from Radhika as well. For me, you know, I think one of the biggest the biggest lessons I've learned, and I've learned it maybe the hard way through trial and error and through some mistakes, is the importance of really following my coachee, the one that I'm coaching, the leader, and allowing them to drive in the process rather than me drive the process. And I think about, for example, a leader that I've been working with in Saudi Arabia, and you know, my typical approach in coaching is a somewhat Western approach, I recognize, which is, you know, we were working for a 6-month duration, and I wanted to begin by really assessing strengths and development opportunities for this individual. And we started there, and I found him to be quite resistant to that being a starting point. Luckily, you know, with his help, we were able to step back and take a different approach. And what I think, you know, I think happened in hindsight is that you know, we just didn't have the trust in our relationship to start talking about things that may have been, you know, things about deficiencies or things that are not going well, and his, you know, level of comfort to speak to essentially a stranger about that. Whereas maybe a Western leader in the US or the UK or Germany that I may have coached would have found that, you know, a very important starting point. So that was a really important takeaway. And I think for me that lesson is listen, you know, listen, and then listen before we jump into the work. Because as, you know, as an American, I think I've been socialized to really drive results. and to be aware of my assumptions and perhaps my biases around that, and then to really start with where my client was, which in this case we did work on from kind of the outside in, more superficial things, and then moved in to where we could really talk about some of those deficiencies later as we developed trust among our relationship. So that's one of my kind of lessons learned. What would you know, what has been your experience, or what would you recommend in terms of lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't do as much one-on-one coaching. I do a lot more work with leaders on the side. I think I completely agree with you, Jean-Marie. I think we need to just leave all our assumptions and all our, you know, preconceptions behind, because we never know what we find. And I think it does begin with sort of that personal relationship. And we'll probably spend 3 sessions talking about family and background and, you know, where they've come from and what they're doing on the weekend and stuff before you actually get into anything. So sometimes it can be kind of quite frustrating, because you see that you feel like you're not making enough progress, but you may not realize, you know, how much that helps with sort of building and fostering that relationship. I think one thing I found really interesting in the last, and it's actually become a little bit more pronounced in the last 2-3 years, is obviously we have monocultures, but we also have a third culture now. So we have a lot of people we work with who have mixed, you know, parents who come from 2 different countries, and they've lived in a third country. They were born in a different country, and now they're living in a completely different country, and they've probably never been to their home country. So I also feel like this third culture, and I was just looking at my personal circle of friends, and 70-80% of our children all belong to parents who come from, you know, different cultural or, you know, national backgrounds. And if I had to coach someone like that, then all my assumptions and all my understanding of culture goes completely out of the window. So I think one really interesting challenge for coaches is also, how do you work with third culture? You know, and how do you kind of navigate that sort of matrix? And I think all of us will start to face this a lot more.
That sounds like a topic maybe that we add to our communities of practice as maybe a after our language session. And from your you know, from your research and your experience working with so many organizations in the Arab world, do you have any recommendations for those coaches on the line here about you know, one of the things I know you were very clear about encouraging us is to really take that mission about developing the future leaders, and how important that is, not only, you know, to a particular organization, but to, you know, to the impact at a much higher level at our way of life. So would you have any recommendations for coaches about you know, what we can do to support this?
Sure. I mean, I think that's, I feel a bit odd you know, answering that question, because I know all of you have a lot more experience every day in this regard. I think just 2 things from me. I think one is obviously I find using certain tools to aid discussions always help, and I'm sure many of us do that, but sometimes we don't. So for example, we use our Thriving Index obviously a lot in the development work that we do, but if you are going in and coaching someone who is actually very low on growth mindset and does not inherently believe that they can change and improve and develop, then that's the first question you ask is, do I really want to coach this person at all? And if I do, how am I going to get around it? So I think being able to understand where your coach is starting off is very, very important. And I think it could be seen as a trend, or you kind of are hired by an organization who says coach everybody in the top team, but guess what, if they're not open for coaching, then do you really want to take that monkey on your back, right? So I think having some tools that obviously understand where we're starting off with someone's really important. And I think sometimes where we do struggle, and it's not just for coaching, but I think it's for HR or people, managers in general, is how do you actually measure success and how do you actually measure impact? So you might have a personal development plan that you've identified with that person of things they want to achieve in the next 6 or 12 months, but how do you kind of quantify that and how do you make that a bit more tangible to demonstrate impact? And I think that's a much bigger question than we can answer today. But I think that's also something that, when you are coaching, how do you actually know that you've actually done a good job at the end of that 12-month or 18-month or 6-month process?
Those are really good. And I see. I want to wrap up by really just turning this to each of you. Can you advance to the next slide? Yeah, and ask you finally the same question that I shared. Is what is the one thing that each of you will do to increase your effectiveness as a coach in the Arab world? And you heard my story about the Saudi leader that I was coaching, and that my lesson is really to continue to listen and adapt, and so if you can, just like we did at the beginning, if you can add in your I think in the questions, what would be the one thing that you would do? What one takeaway? What one action? Would you take to increase your effectiveness as a coach here? And while you're typing those in, we'll share those a little bit later. But while you're doing that, we also want to open up the line to questions for Radhika. About anything that we've covered tonight. So send us your questions as well, and we'll open up the line and give you a chance to ask them, or maybe even again, if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, raise your hand in the control panel. And we'll unmute your line so that you can ask Radhika a question. I don't see any hands raised, so as you're pondering those questions, or even if they're not a question, we'd love to hear your experience, your thoughts about these topics that we've been talking about the context and the uniqueness of the Arab world, about the leadership qualities of leaders in this region, and also about the coaching implications. We are getting a few input on what you're going to focus on. I think. Let's see.
There's a question, and I think there are two.
Yeah, Jessica has a question. Is that right?
Jennifer.
Oh, Jennifer. Sorry, my apologies. Let's see. How do we get to Jennifer?
We just just go
bear
back
with
to the
us.
screen. Yeah.
Somehow we lost.
Click back on that.
We lost our attendees. That's strange.
See if I can see.
We're trying to find our list of attendees. We had you over here. Here you are. Okay. Sorry, this is a learning curve for us on the GoToWebinar. Jennifer, we're going to unmute your line and ask, you have a question for Radhika, is that right?
Yes, good evening. I was wondering, how do you define young people when you speak about the paradox of plenty?
Sure, great question, and I'm glad you asked. I think for us, we kind of clarify young people. I think if you look at sort of labor market statistics, it does vary, but it's the statistics we use is actually under 25. Some kind of data we see is actually under 30, but we look at anyone who's under 25 from an age perspective. Because a lot of the data around employment and population is usually for under 25, or it's those who are actually actively in employment or not. But most of the research we do, we break it up into, you know, blocks of 10. So it's kind of 14 to 25, 16 to 25, 26 to 34. So that's when we do our research, that's the blocks we look at from an age perspective.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments or learnings or questions that they'd like to add at this point? Okay, Suhair, thank you very much. I'm going to unmute you. Suhair, are you there?
I am here. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. Hello, Suhair. Suhair, can you hear us? Okay, I think we have maybe a struggling with the connection, but if it's okay, I'll read your question out loud. How do we dissolve barriers and speak one to another heart to heart?
If you just click on it, it might be able to. Keep it on.
Yeah.
The next one. Yeah.
How do we dissolve barriers and speak one to another heart to heart rather than culture to culture, as I believe that our human connection is universal? How would you answer that, Radhika?
Jean Marie, how would you answer that? I'd love to kind of ask you about your experiences, and I can add to it.
Yeah, you know, you used a word that I think is very powerful earlier, and I think it's authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, only from my limited experience is, you know, is you just be honest about what you don't know as much as what you do know. I think we try to show our expertise, especially in professions like coaches.
Yeah.
And that would be my, you know, from my experience, I would say, and, you know, it does take some courage to say, I don't know the answer to that, or can you help me understand, you know, what's appropriate, what would be comfortable for you from your perspective and your experience. And I find when I do have the courage to ask those questions, that I get remarkable answers and a breakthrough, frankly, in the trust that's being developed.
Yeah. And so I would completely agree with you. I think a lot of our connection, I know we've talked a lot about differences today, but there are a lot of similarities, and the basic fundamental human connection is universal. I feel when we are working with other individuals, we're learning and growing as well. And I think a lot of self-disclosure, more than you'd probably do anywhere else, because they're actually as curious and interested to know about your journey. So a lot more about that sense of personal connection, again, like I talked about. And I think even though you might be coaching in a workplace context, that sense of relatedness, that sense of how can I spend more time with my family, a lot of times, a lot of personal coaching issues or questions do arise, and I think it's about being open to having worked through that relationship as well, and not saying, oh, we're only going to talk about this, but this is not something I want to talk about. So, and it's always a tough balance, but I really feel to kind of have other people open up, you do need to have a lot more self-disclosure here than you would anywhere else, because those lines are a little bit more blurred.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm unmuting Marika. Marika, you added a comment, an insight. Would you be so kind to share that with everybody?
Yes, sure, I will. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, it's just very, very simple for me. When I came into the session, I thought it is all very complicated, thinking about this cross-cultural coaching and how to deal with different nationalities and cultural backgrounds. But after the session now, I think it all just comes back to the core competencies of coaching. Building the trust and listen to connect. So that was my insight of the session.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. In a way, it is that simple, isn't it? Yeah, and you know, that building trust and listening to connect and being authentic. These are really the basic competencies of our coaching practice. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're monitoring some of the questions. See if we have any more. Let's see, Lena, I'm going to go ahead and put you on, I'm unmuting your line, Lena. If you could share your question with the group.
I think she's muted. Lena, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, we're not hearing you, Lena.
Online. Yeah.
Hello? Hello?
Hi, Lena.
Hello? Hi. First, it was a really wonderful webinar, so thank you very much. And I was having some difficulties actually with the line as well as the slides. So I heard something about the increased inclusion of the females in the workplace, which was really very interesting to me, and some statistics which I have missed. And because this is one part of my role as a coach, is in the females in the Arab world and their role in the workplace and their entrepreneurship. And I also heard that the entry level is really high. However, going up in the career ladder, they show up less and less, which we already know. So my question is, the statistics you were talking about are based, are they found anywhere in your books? Is it your own statistics, or they're just available somewhere else?
Sure. Happy to share more offline as well, Lena. Thank you for your question. So a lot of the research we've done recently, especially on female talent, was for a new book that we wrote earlier this year. Actually, wow, time's flown. It was we launched the book last year. It's called Game Changers. And it really talks about how women in the Arab world are shaping and changing the rules. Some of the data I'd shared around labor market participation is obviously secondary data, because there is a lot of that available, especially around if you're looking at trends around educational outcomes, or you're looking at trends around labor market participation. So that is from secondary resources, and I'm happy to share where we've got those from. The research we've done specifically for the book is really around the social and psychological contract for females within the workplace. So I talked briefly about sort of the motivators, the self-selection of females, both expatriate and national, who choose to work in the workplace, some of the psychological skills that they have. We obviously know this globally. It's no surprise here that a lot of the skills that females have around some of the things we've talked about for leaders, grit, resilience, curiosity, growth mindset, are typically higher amongst female workers. We also find that they're actually much more inclusive and much more comfortable working in diverse cultural contexts than their male counterparts. So there's some really interesting research that we've done around how those aspects play out at work, and some of the psychological aspects for female workers. And then lastly, we talk a lot around what can be done from an organizational policy and personal perspective around managing those career transitions, and actually not just joining the workforce, but actually staying on and contributing to the workplace for longer.
And Lena, this is Jean Marie. I just want to add, if I really highly encourage you to find Radhika's book on Game Changers, how women in the Arab world are changing the rules and shaping the future. It's very compelling, and I haven't found a lot of this information anywhere else. So I think it's an excellent resource. So where you can find this in all the bookstores?
I think it should be in most of the bookstores. Most of the big, you can find it online as well. And I think one thing that's really interesting about females is also entrepreneurship, which we've not really talked about today. So obviously females are in the formal labor market, they're in the informal labor market, but there's also obviously, and I'm sure many of you work with females who are entrepreneurs, and they obviously have their own interesting set of challenges, but also opportunities.
And while we're talking about Radhika's resources, I also highly recommend, as a practicing coach here in the Arab world, that you consider getting certified on the Thrive Index assessment tool that you can use in your coaching practice. Can you speak, Radhika, about how how a coach, if they're interested in adding that to their toolkit, might do that?
Sure. So we'd be, I mean, maybe Jean Marie, when you share the slides, you can maybe share my contact details as well. Like I said, I think a tool is a tool, and I don't want to make this self-promotional at all, because it really is about your work and what helps you. But it's a interesting assessment in the sense that it really looks at strengths. So we are kind of focusing on how do you actually coach people to kind of play more to their strengths. And I know there's a lot of points of view around what happens to weaknesses, what happens to blind spots, and that's really important. And I think we talk a lot in coaching or in development more broadly about what happens if strengths are taken too far, and how can you overuse strengths or make them into blind spots. I think what's interesting, which we find that other assessments may not measure, are these aspects around resilience or growth mindset or grit, motivation, which we actually find are quite distinct in the Arab world for expatriates and for nationals. So that makes the conversation a lot more interesting. But we also find, and we've used a lot of other tools in our work, it really changes the conversation if you are really talking about strengths. At that point, once you build the trust and get comfortable with your coach about how can you use these more in your work life or your professional life. So it's a great tool in our personal experience, and if you're keen to know more, we'd be happy to share more. And it really is founded in some of the latest research in positive psychology, in optimal performance, happiness, well-being, and a lot of it talks about when you are, very simply, it just says when you are put into contexts where you're playing to your strengths, you basically display positive emotions. And what happens if you are feeling happier or more productive, it leads to higher performance at work. So it's in a very simple way, it's basically strengths equals feeling positive emotions, and feeling positive emotions leads to positive performance and optimal performance, engagement, creativity, problem solving, decision making, all the things we care about for our leaders, and that very simply is a relationship between the three.
Excellent, excellent, and I will commit, especially since we had such problems with our slides. After this session, I will send out to all of you as a handout. I'll send out our slides, and I will make sure that we have Radhika's contact information. So if you are, if you would like to consider getting certified, I'm certified in the Thrive Index and use it in my practice. And if you're considering doing that, feel free to reach out to her. So thank you. I see our time has gone quite quickly, right? I hope it's the case for everybody on the call. But it's been really a pleasure to have you as our guest and sharing some of your phenomenal work in the Arab world. And I just thought I would come back and share a couple of a couple of inputs to the question that I asked about bringing it to your, bringing it, how will you incorporate some of this learning that we've talked about tonight into your coaching practice to increase your effectiveness. So, so I've heard from some of you on the question board, and I'll share some of these. One is understanding the culture. What is okay and not okay to do as a coach? So that's going to be a focus for somebody. Another one is to focus less on needing to drive results quickly and more on building the trust first, which is very similar to what I'm working on as well. So thank you very much. Thank you, Radhika, and thank you to all of the participants for sharing your evening with us. We really appreciate it. We hope you will consider joining us again in our next session, which will be after the summer, and we'll be sending you out notices and letting you know when our next session will be. We also will be sending you a feedback survey after this session and ask you to take a few minutes and let us know what you thought of this session. Certainly what you liked, but also things that you'd like to see different, and also input about topics that you'd like to hear about going forward, and we'll work very hard to try to include those in our future sessions. So with that, I wish you all a good evening. I wish you all a fantastic International Coaching Week, the remainder of it. And my sincere thanks, my sincere thanks for your help and your participation. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.